Okay, well, we're going to go on and get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Grant Quatermass, the Jenrette Foundation's curator and director of collections, and I'll be your host for the evening. I also have the pleasure of directing the Thompson Fellowship program, where each year we welcome two cohorts of fellows who are either graduate students or emerging museum professionals to one of our properties for a week of continuing professional education, mentorship, and networking, as well as visits to other historic house museums in the region. The Fall Thompson Fellowship takes place in late October at Edgewater, our property in the Hudson River Valley of New York. During the week at Edgewater, fellowship participants undertake an individual project related to their own professional or research interest, utilizing Edgewater's significant collection or focused on some aspect of the house or its history. Tonight, you'll be hearing from the members of our fall cohort who will present their projects. And I should say that this fellowship is named in memory of William L. Thompson, the longtime partner of our founder, Richard Hampton Jenrette. Bill Thompson was instrumental in the restoration, furnishing, and landscaping of each of the Jenrette Foundation's properties, and he played an important role in building our significant collection of American decorative arts and fine art. So, with that, I want to welcome our first speaker, Philippa Pitts. Philippa is a PhD candidate in the history of art and architecture at Boston University and currently the Luce Americana Foundation Curatorial Fellow in American Art at Historic Deerfield. So I'll welcome Philippa to the virtual podium to share her investigation of Edgewater's mid-19th century greenhouse.
Thank you so much, Grant, for that lovely introduction. Let me take a moment to share my screen. Okay, wonderful. Yes, so thank you to Grant and to everyone at the Jenrette Foundation for this opportunity to delve into the connections between historic homes and the plant humanities. My project at Edgewater continues to preoccupy my mind, and I'm delighted to be able to share a little bit of that with you all tonight. So the title of my talk is, as you see here, From Greenhouses to Window Gardens, and it focuses on some of the changes made to Edgewater by its second owner, Robert Donaldson. So, to begin. When Robert Donaldson moved from his beloved estate at Blythewood to Sylvania, pictured here, he intended to stay in the existing house only long enough to construct a new villa on the hills overlooking the Hudson River. But within a year, he had changed his mind, deciding to, quote, live and die in this Greek temple on the banks of the river, which he would rename Edgewater. With this change in plans came a slew of requests to his friend and longtime collaborator, architect Alexander Jackson Davis, to renovate the house and the property to match Donaldson's style and ambitions. Early letters reference a new picture room and library, which is a now iconic feature of Edgewater as seen here, as well as a prospect tower, an observatory, a boathouse, a gate, and a Sabbath schoolhouse. Donaldson also envisioned a large freestanding octagonal greenhouse connected to the existing dining room via a narrow glass hallway on the opposite wing of the house from the library. Although references to the structure dominate Donaldson's early correspondence, it was never built. It was replaced instead by a small bay window, and the why remains a mystery. So, over the next 15 minutes, we'll speculate on some answers by looking closely at this space and contextualizing it within the surviving records of Blythewood and other contemporary properties. But I'll also encourage us to think deeply about plants and about the meanings that were invested in them in the 19th century. What emerges are not only practical insights into how this space might have been installed in Donaldson's time, but an opportunity to reflect on the place of plants in historic house interpretation. So, let's begin on unstable ground. Terms such as greenhouse, glasshouse, hothouse, and conservatory were used in overlapping and contradictory ways across the 19th century. Fortunately for us, Donaldson explains his vision in detail in an early letter to Davis. As we see here in a rough sketch included in that letter, the greenhouse is connected to the existing dining room via a glass corridor. He also writes that the greenhouse is to be placed on a terrace, to be octagonal with iron rafters, 28 feet in diameter, and glazed with large glass on the sides with bold mullions and subdivisions. This proposed size, for reference, is almost as large as the library at Edgewater today. Returning to Donaldson's roughly sketched plan, we see that it's not just a relationship in terms of size and shape that link these two spaces. The library and the greenhouse flank the existing building with a carefully uninterrupted sightline running from one to the other. This architectural relationship, I argue, reflected the place of botany within 19th century culture. Botany in the 19th century was a common professional pursuit, a popular personal passion, and a topic of polite conversation. This was the age when global plant exchange really came into full swing, accompanied by a rise in affordable print technologies that dispersed images and information about plants to an increasingly literate population. As one European visitor remarked, 19th century America was truly a nation of botanists. So, Robert Donaldson was not only an astute businessman, he was well educated, well traveled, a patron of the arts and culture, and he engaged in commercial agriculture at both Blythewood and Edgewater, but not as some industrial agricultural magnate. He was what was then termed a scientific farmer. Horticulture in this moment was a field of active international scientific research, which Donaldson was deeply connected to, first by prominent New York physician David Hosack, and then by celebrated landscape designer and influential author Andrew Jackson Downing, with whom Donaldson and architect Davis became longtime collaborators and close friends. In this world, new species were not only cultivated, they were published. Pomology, or the study of fruits, was pursued with particular enthusiasm, as we see here, in which Mr. Lindley Ferris of Coldenham, New York, has discovered, quote, unquestionably the largest and most beautiful of all cherries, scarcely known at all to pomologists. Robert's red cherry from Salem, Massachusetts, is also prized for its hardiness, and a Mr. Sinclair of Baltimore is praised for his particularly productive plum tree varietal. These publications produced an educated fruit-buying populace who, as one mid-century horticulturalist noted, asked for their fruits by name. They wanted Spitzenbergs, Baldwins, Roxbury russets, and Rhode Island greenings, not just red and green apples. They read books like Hovey's Fruits of America, which features illustrations of 96 varieties of fruit trees, including 54 types of pear, all executed in stunning detail using cutting-edge chromolithography by William Sharp. In this context, a greenhouse is not unlike a library. Both were archives, compilations of knowledge, places for research. Both were filled with rare objects intended for close study and conspicuous display. The study and cultivation of plants was also deeply associated with moral self-improvement. And as one scholar quipped, Downing was convinced that horticulture would, quote, save America from materialism, restlessness, and even intemperance. In his 1849 Theory and Practice of Landscapes, Downing writes that, quote, nothing can be more gratifying than a vista in winter through a glass door down the walk of a conservatory. How much more refined and elevated is the taste which prefers such accessories to a dwelling rather than costly furniture or an extravagant display of plate. John Buist clearly concurred, writing, quote, there are few surer indices to the characters of the inmates of a dwelling than the presence of plants. Those who can only derive enjoyment from excitement and the glare of wealth may smile at this conceit, but to us it is as sure an evidence of a refined mind as the exquisite texture of the hangings or the mirror-like purity of the glass. So while Donaldson certainly did not forego furniture, material luxuries, or expansive architectural projects, the prominence of the greenhouse here would stake a complementary claim that spoke to his taste and judgment. And as an aside here, it's lovely to see in the Donaldson's own family correspondence these same themes coming through. So it's not just the published text, it's the personal correspondence as well. So with all this in mind, why then was the library built, but not the greenhouse? Money was likely not an issue, given the profit that Donaldson had made in selling his previous house, Blythewood, paired with the opportunity to purchase Sylvania at a severely reduced price after the introduction of a railroad that bisected the property. Nor was it the preservation of nearby trees, as Donaldson wrote candidly to Davis that I expect to extend the house, to remove trees and introduce shrubbery. I suspect that the major factor was, ultimately, the Hudson itself. The suggested site does face south, which is the optimal orientation for an attached greenhouse. However, its eastern light was to be impeded by this greenery that shades and obscures the railroad tracks adjacent to the house. And worse, from the west comes this unobstructed cold air from the Hudson, with its infamously strong storm winds. Donaldson's gardeners were experts in their field. They were particularly adept at adapting greenhouses to the colder climate of the Hudson River Valley. One, George Kidd, had published multiple articles on their innovations. In 1848, he attributed his success at cultivating greenhouse grapes, a feat that had never before been achieved in this region, to the location of the greenhouse, placed in a small valley with a thick belt of trees protecting it from the wind. So in short, Donaldson and his team were very aware of the effect of the surrounding environment on greenhouse temperatures, and the location that Donaldson eventually selected for the greenhouse that he built was far better. It was on the other side of those train tracks, next to his garden and his orchard. Ultimately, we know little about Edgewater's greenhouse beyond its surviving foundations. However, Donaldson's previous greenhouse at Blythewood may offer some clues. This was, according to the American Agriculturalist, 90 feet long, filled with, quote, a great variety of foreign grapes, the fig, apricot, nectarines, plum, and peach trees. Yet the center, which is differentiated by that Gothic architectural ornament that you see here, was, quote, filled with summer blooming plants, which are so gay and bright from May to December. Donaldson's revised plan for Edgewater likely replicated this combined arrangement of personal passions and professional pursuits, thus relocating rather than abandoning his idea of a living library. So, how then did this small octagonal projection come to be? I argue that rather than perceiving the space as a failure or a compromise to Donaldson's initial vision, we should understand it on its own terms. The bay window, as this space is often described, was an existing part of Davis's architectural vocabulary. Indeed, we find a prominent example of it in Edgewater's own library. But that projection of the room onto the river landscape is very different from this glass enclosed space, which is attached to the dining room, but can be sealed off with first French windows and then shutters, and as you see is delineated by differences in both ceiling height and floor treatment. I argue that this space is neither a greenhouse nor a bay window, but a window garden. These were also referred to as window verandas or plant cabinets, but the window garden was a distinct architectural form in its own right, described across a swathe of period texts. It was an elevation of the usual practice of putting potted plants on windowsills. The forms of these window gardens varied widely. A 6-page essay on window gardening and plant cases, published in The Horticulturalist, describes balconies turned into greenhouses, miniature conservatories, and, quote, little paradises adjoining bedrooms that were filled with tropical plants that survived even in the depths of winter. Another 4-page article on the same topic appeared in the following month. Books like Shirley Hibbard's Rustic Adornments for Homes of Taste offered up stunning visions like this one. Here, a glass space projects out from a parlor, so marked by its lovely harp and chair. But inside, we find not only hanging and potted plants of all varieties, but even a fountain. And heavy drapes on either side allow the space to be closed off as desired. Indeed, the most common elements ascribed to window gardens were that they were attached to dining or living rooms and could be sealed off using French doors, just as Edgewater's is. So, analysis of the extant space at Edgewater gives us some idea of what type of window garden this may have been. Clearly, it is not designed for overwintering. When the stucco was applied to the exterior facade of the building, they actually left a gap around this extension, which indicates that the room was never sealed to preserve its internal temperature and humidity. It is also, as you see, raised up on 4 pillars, which creates a space beneath the floor that not only increased heat loss, but actually could have been used either for a small stove or to connect the greenhouse to the kitchen hearth below if desired, which would have allowed it to be heated throughout the winter. Instead, it seems that these choices were collectively made to encourage healthy air circulation for the plants within, with the French doors preventing those drafts from entering the main house when necessary. So temperature and humidity would only have been allowed to fluctuate in this way if the plants were rotated seasonally or at will to produce a kind of curated display. And this was a common practice, with manuals offering plentiful advice on how to keep those, quote, pets of the parlor window healthy all season long through removal to different parts of the house. In Donaldson's case, potted plants were likely cultivated in his main greenhouse, with choice specimens selected for temporary arrangement in the house's window garden. This theory is also supported actually by the opaque roof of this space, because plants kept in here for any length of time would, as Downing cautioned, develop weakened stems and an aesthetically displeasing lean outwards towards the sources of light, i.e. the side windows. So, what might these temporary curated arrangements have looked like? Donaldson certainly would have had the space and the funds to pursue an elaborate installation like this one. Period texts also describe shelves placed to create a tiered effect and to share light. They reference plentiful trailing vines as well as different species grouped together to create pleasing visual effects. In more elaborate cases, we read about bird cages, goldfish bowls, and small seats. Hibbard, the author of Rustic Adornments for Homes of Taste, particularly advised his readers to create small scaffolds of wire and wood that would allow for a very theatrical hanging of vines in the summer, but could be removed in the winter. And if this kind of design seems overly complex, it should be compared to other plant installations of the period. Botanical furniture extended far beyond mere plinths and vases. It included terraria in the form of miniature palaces, rolling trellises, as seen here, that could be moved from room to room like itinerant bowers. We read about ivy that was trained to form a rustic canopy inside of drawing rooms, bamboo supported espaliers that served as window screens for city homes, and entire green walls hung with pots of flowering plants. Today, it would be difficult for a historic home to reproduce these kinds of living installations. They require constant care and upkeep, as well as the larger infrastructure of a thriving commercial greenhouse to support their rotations. Moreover, as we'll hear from Seth, the presence of plants introduces risks to the collections, most notably in the form of bugs and pests. However, I think that we must acknowledge that without these living furnishings, from window gardens to parlor plants, terraria, and even cut flowers, these interiors lack something that was seen as crucial in their day. And their absence also creates artificial boundaries of indoor versus outdoor spaces, personal passions versus professional pursuits that really are not reflective of the porousness of these categories in the 19th century. So, in the same way that soundscapes return something lost to these once inhabited spaces, plants bring life into rooms that have become unnaturally dead. Thus, even when we can't reproduce these effects, I think that drawing attention to that omission is important. So, thank you so much for letting me share a little bit of that. And thank you again to the Generette Foundation for supporting this really fascinating question.
Thank you, Philippa. That was fascinating. That was great. Definitely got me thinking about that space again in a very different way. So, next, I want to welcome Seth Frost to the virtual podium. Seth is a National Park Service museum technician at the Roosevelt Vanderbilt National Historic Site in Hyde Park, New York. And Seth's going to discuss the creation of an IPM plan. That's museum speak for Integrated Pest Management. So, with that, I will turn it over to Seth.
All right. And everyone can see the presentation okay? So, as Grant mentioned, I prepared an integrated pest management plan for Edgewater and for the Ginrett Foundation, hopefully to implement and find helpful. So, what is IPM? So, IPM is a strategy that emphasizes prevention and minimizes the use of toxic chemicals to manage and eliminate pests. Museum pests refer to a broad array of both vertebrate and invertebrate organisms that can invade museum structures and damage collection objects. IPM plans are designed to help museums and historic sites identify the extent of biological infestations, potentially hazardous to collections and to human health, as well as to determine appropriate steps to mitigate these threats. So, for the plan prepared for Edgewater, my ultimate goal was to find a solution that was useful but also flexible without being too overwhelming. There are a lot of different websites that include or provide information about IPM, so I didn't want to have anything that was too overwhelming or too redundant. So it was very helpful, I thought, to include a recommendation for a food and plant control policy. Those are two methods of restricting or preventing uh, food for food sources for pests from entering the house by restricting their access in the first place. I also recommended IPM trap locations, suggested supplies and equipment to analyze traps, and then also included information on potentially hazardous museum pests that are native to the Hudson Valley specifically, and appropriate protective equipment or PPE to mitigate those risks for the staff. And a log to track pest activity was also included. Traps were briefly deployed during the course of the fellowship and analyzed. So 50 traps were deployed on Tuesday and collected on Friday morning. So pests in house museums are particularly IPM is particularly important for house museums because of the nature of the collection that is being exhibited and the nature of the structure themselves. Unlike traditional gallery museums, house museums typically exhibit a much larger percentage of the collection, and they often have objects of a very diverse material or medium. So often, as you can see in this photograph here on the right, there are wood objects and textiles. Those are both very sensitive to pest activity. Frequently, house museums are in, of course, historic structures that are poorly sealed and dimly lit, which provide ample access and thriving habitat for pests and mold to grow. The materials also used to construct historic structures are organic, so they themselves are a source of food for many types of pests, such as termites. Upkeep to the building itself is critical to the stability of the structure, but also helps prevent pests from accessing the collection. So here we have a few common pests, while there are, of course, hundreds of different museum pests. Here are some that we might be aware of already, but they are definitely more common and very hazardous to collections. So we can see at top left a clothes moth, then powder post beetle, and below that a silverfish. For the insects, we'll look at briefly. And then for vertebrates, here we have a mouse, rats, birds, and bats. Raccoons, of course, are also a concern. And then finally, mold. Here we have a few examples of damage caused by the insects we just saw. So that is a silverfish in the process of eating a book binding or the spine on the book because they are particularly interested in starch. So that is frequently used in bookbinding adhesive. So silverfish are known to eat wallpaper, anything with adhesive paste, glazed paper. They also have been found eating tissue paper, packing materials, bookbinding, textiles, cotton, silk, and other materials with glues. In the center photograph, we have a textile being eaten by clothes moths. Um, of course, based on their name, you can tell that they eat clothing or wool or other fibers, but they all are also known to eat materials with feathers, rugs, felt, hair, skin, tobacco, hemp products. So quite the variety of organic materials. And then at right, this is the back of a sculpture, and these are holes from powder post beetles, also known as furniture beetles. Of course, they don't only eat furniture, they primarily eat wood, so that includes flooring, wood framing, timber, lumber, and other wood objects, including furniture. Mold is also treated within IPM programs. This is actually a chair in the Vanderbilt Mansion National Historic Site. You can see quite the active mold growth on the back of the chair. So mold is extremely hazardous to human health depending on the species, and there are thousands of different types of mold, but it's always important to prioritize the health of the staff as well as the collection. So we'll get into the PPE of mold in a moment, but mold is extremely difficult to remove. Essentially, mold is managed, not removed. Effective prevention strategies for minimizing mold outbreaks include climate control, spore reduction, careful monitoring, and ongoing maintenance to help seal the structure. It is critical to identify, monitor, remedy sources of water and moisture within historic structures or other facilities holding museum collections or archival material. Collection storage and exhibit space should be checked very routinely, especially after high humidity or water disaster events. With those events, mold outbreaks are much more likely. So for treating mold, it's very dependent on the material that is being contaminated by mold, but the mold should first be deactivated, and that can be done by freezing the object, and it's always helpful to consult a conservator for additional guidance before actually treating anything with a freezer treatment. This can also be done with air drying, depending on the material, such as a book. Um, Vacuuming is a very effective way of removing mold growth and reduces the spores in the storage or exhibit space. You should always use a HEPA filter vacuum when using a vacuum to remove mold spores. The HEPA filter will prevent mold spores from contaminating other objects in that space or within the collection once the vacuum is moved to another location. While cleaning mold, it is extremely important not to reuse the same supplies, so brushes or vacuum attachments, on non-contaminated objects. So anything used should be sealed in a plastic bag and labeled for mold. It should only be used on other moldy objects in the future so that mold is not introduced to the remainder of the collection. So the foundation of integrated pest management is actually preventing the pests from entering the museum or the storage area in the very first place. So controlling temperature and humidity is critical. It helps prevent mold growth and other pests depending on the species. They prefer much cooler or more humid environments. So maintaining an environment with 50% humidity roughly is always helpful. And it's also helpful for the objects depending on the material. Say if it's a piece of furniture with veneer, ranging humidity levels will prove extremely damaging to certain materials. Of course, in an exhibit space, higher temperatures around 70 degrees are fine for certain objects, while in storage, a range of roughly 50 to 55 degrees is preferred. Sealing the building by making sure cracks and other entry points are secure is also extremely important for preventing pests from entering the structure and damaging the collection. Specifically for rodents, copper mesh is advised, so they are not really capable of chewing through copper. So that is the most appropriate way of sealing a hole to prevent rodents, such as mice, from entering a structure. It's also very important to keep food out of collection areas and away from storage and other exhibit spaces. And then, of course, regular housekeeping, such as vacuuming, dusting, and removing clutter from exhibit and storage spaces is very important following a housekeeping plan that reduces sources of food and harborage for insects. And then quarantining new accession or acquisitions is also very important as well. So new objects that are entering either storage or exhibit should be first quarantined. You can place them on like a large white sheet of paper, depending on the size of the material, to see if any frass is coming off of the object. That can be used to determine if there are any current infestations that the museum staff should be aware of. And by treating it before it's actually put with other objects, you can hopefully reduce the risk of exposing additional collections to the infestation. So monitoring is the next step after attempting to prevent pests from entering the building. Monitoring allows you to actually know what is inside the facility. That can be used done by using these blender traps or sticky traps. These are for insects to actually walk on. They will be stuck on the adhesive glue that is present. Of course, this doesn't necessarily capture flying insects such as clothes moths, which are very detrimental to collections. So in the event of a large clothes moth presence, you can use pheromones to attract insects. And while the goal of IPM is not to capture insects or any museum pest, it is to understand what is present in the facility so that way you can inform your response. These traps should be placed along walls at entry points or near objects of specific concern. Traps should actually be checked routinely for pest activity. Sometimes a mouse will be stuck in a sticky trap. Those should be removed quickly. If any vertebrates are caught in a sticky trap and pass away, or they will decompose and attract other insects or other rodents. So it's critical to remove them quickly. and safely. So again, we'll get to PPE. You should also periodically inspect museum objects in storage for mold growth. So if you have specimen cabinets or other storage units, it's always a good idea to regularly check them. Not all of them, but take a nice random sample based on the size of the collection and the materials stored in a specimen cabinet. The traps should actually be collected monthly and replaced, or quarterly based on the season and staffing levels, and they should be placed in the same location as the traps that were collected. And I'll share a single page of the floor plan with locations that I developed during the fellowship. The data that is collected from analyzing these traps should be recorded in well, I use an Excel spreadsheet, but you can use other methods to organize the data in a log. And this will also be used to inform housekeeping and collection care procedures at the museum. So here we have an image of the drawing room at Edgewater. And at right, you can see under the pier table, one of the sticky traps that was deployed. And this was specifically deployed under this pier table because of its proximity to two access points. It's also located under a piece of furniture, which is ideal as pests prefer to stay out of human traffic areas or paths. So it's also very beneficial not to step on your traps that makes it very difficult to analyze them. But it's under a piece of wood furniture. So hopefully if there are powder post beetles, this can inform the staff of that. And its proximity to the rug will also be helpful to catch other insects that might eat textiles as well. So here's the floor plan of the first floor of Edgewater based on the traps that were implemented. And as I had mentioned before, there were 50 traps in total deployed throughout the home. They are labeled based on their floor. So this starts at 101, 102, 103, and so on. The basement traps start at B01, B02, and so on. That allows you to make alterations to each floor level without changing every single trap if they were just numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on. Again, flexibility is very important in an IPM plan. As factors change, such as climate, collections in the house, other infestations that might become present, the plan should allow for some sort of flexibility to address changing factors. And as you can see, a lot of these traps are located near sources of food, such as in the kitchen area, or they are near different access points, such as exterior doors. It also helped to identify locations within Edgewater that had some obvious pest activity. Thankfully, there were very few spaces with pest activity that was obviously noticeable. And these are two of those spaces. Both of these were on the third floor in the library. So at left, you can see cobwebs or spider webs. And then at right, at the base of the book spine, you can see insect frass in an insect wing, a segment of an insect wing. So these are good indicators that pest activity is going on in or around the books. So once you analyze the traps, it's very important to accurately identify the insects or the pests that are present within the museum or the collection. With misidentified insects, your ability to successfully treat them is diminished. You need to know what you're dealing with to effectively remove them. It's always helpful to consult an expert if you're in doubt, if you don't know what is necessarily present, if you have a hard time identifying them. And it's always helpful to use reference images. So museumpests.net is a wonderful resource for anyone interested in developing an IPM plan. And I'll share more information about that as well. But they actually also offer an email chain that anyone can sign up for. And it's just a bunch of photographs that professionals at other museums and universities and archives share with each other to help identify pests and recommend different treatment opportunities. This is actually a photograph or a screenshot of the Excel sheet. So this shows some of the insect types that were present over that Tuesday through Friday window. So at left, the columns are or rather the rows show the type of pests that were being inspected for. And this is actually based on the log used at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, which is the former home of Theodore Roosevelt on Oyster Bay on Long Island. And they have quite the IPM issue at that specific house, mostly related to the extensive taxidermy collection there. But this is a very robust sheet that can be used at other museums, and I recommended it for use at Edgewater. So, of the 50 traps, several species of insects were actually found. So, in total, 11 different species were identified, with 42 individual pests being present. So I won't go into specific details just for time restraints about the different treatment opportunities, but non-chemical treatments are definitely prioritized. Um, and again, always consult a conservator if you have any different opinions or if you want further guidance. Objects, depending on the material, can be frozen. Uh, Heat treatment is much rarer. It's more difficult and can cause much more severe damage to an object. And then more recently, anoxic treatment has been very popular. It's much safer for most objects, unless they have a very specific blue dye, which will cause it to rust. So that will damage certain objects with a blue dye. And then chemical treatment, as mentioned before, is not ideal. Chemicals should be used only as a last resort for extreme infestations. It's always important to first consult conservators before even considering a chemical approach to pest management in a museum setting. It should only ever be applied by professionals. Um, and for New York State, which of course where Edgewater is located, you will be required by the state government to actually document the types of pesticides used in the museum every year, inside and out, if you're using them on the grounds. And then they also will require documentation on the volume of each pesticide used. So documentation is extremely important, not only for legal reasons, but for future conservation of museum objects. So personal protective equipment, or PPE, as mentioned before, is extremely important when managing mold. Thankfully, you typically don't have to worry about any PPE when dealing with insects. While there are stinging insects in the Hudson Valley and people may be allergic to them, there aren't very many species of venomous spider in the Hudson Valley, although there are black widows. If they are ever noticed in the facility, it's extremely important to note that on the IPM log. But generally, these type of supplies should be used when managing mold or removing deceased rodents, birds, or bats from the collection. Fit test respirators with HEPA filters are very important for mold. And again, if you're removing deceased vertebrates, nitrile gloves are always helpful, especially when dealing with sticky traps, so that way your fingers don't get sticky. Tyvek suits are pretty much only useful for extreme outbreaks of mold, and goggles as well should be worn with the Tyvek suit. And thick leather gloves should also be considered when removing believed to be deceased rodents. You don't want to be bitten by a mouse that you believe has passed away. And they should also be, of course, worn when trying to remove bats. Bats are definitely prevalent in house museums and historic structures here in the Hudson Valley. Um, the majority of people that actually die from rabies are exposed through bats. Mice and rats have never actually been identified as passing along rabies virus from rodents to humans. So the key takeaways from IPM is that it is a proactive program designed to address pest activities without the use of chemicals. It prevents the irreversible damage of museum and archival collections and reduces costly conservation treatments. And IPM also helps preserve the historic structure. When in doubt, always consult experts, including museum object conservators. And to be successful, IPM programs rely on full staff buy-in, and they always encourage participation from everyone in the staff to make sure that anything is recorded or documented, make sure that doors are consistently closed, report holes to maintenance, and to only eat food in designated areas of the museum, and not to bring in live plants, as we heard about briefly in the last presentation. So if you're looking for more information on IPM in general, if you're a collector and interested in ways to preserve your own collection, here are a few helpful resources. So museumpests.net is a great resource. They actually have templates and examples of other IPM program plans. They also have information on treatment and preventative tactics. The National Park Service has some great resources as well. So conservograms are helpful. They have step-by-step instructions to freeze certain objects or place them in anoxic chambers. They also have other information about preventing pests from entering the building. Another national park resource is the Museum Handbook, Part 1, Chapter 5. They have the entire chapter specifically on biological infestations. And if you're looking for a museum conservator, AIC has information on contacting object conservators in your local area. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Great information, especially for anyone in the audience who may live in a historic house or collect and may be dealing with some of these issues with their own collection or house. So next, I'm going to welcome Bethany McGlynn. Bethany is a PhD candidate at the University of Virginia, and she's going to discuss her investigation of a Caribbean domestic scene, a work of art that in the collection that Mr. Ginrette displayed in his bedroom, and the fascinating discoveries that she's made about it. So, Bethany, I'm going to turn the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you so much, Grant. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, I am going to hope that you can all see this and start talking. Thank you so much to everyone who is logged on tonight. And in rapid succession, thank you to Grant, Ben, Kevin, Will, Joe, Julius, Weston, Alexander, and Duncan. I hope that's everybody, both for tonight and for making our week at Edgewater possible. I'm really excited to share a little bit about my Thompson Fellowship project with you all tonight. I'm so excited about this object, actually, that it wasn't my initial pick, but when I saw it in person, I begged Grant to let me switch my object, and I'm very grateful that he did. My object is a small, rather unassuming at first glance, watercolor of the interior of a home in St. Croix in the Danish West Indies. This watercolor hangs in Mr. Ginrette's bedroom at Edgewater, right next to the entrance to the bathroom if you've been in there, and hangs beneath another watercolor of St. Croix, this one a landscape of Christiansted Harbor. Mr. Ginrette purchased these two watercolors from Donald Held Rare Books in 2005. And these two pieces together are really fascinating to me amidst the larger collection of American neoclassical furniture and decorative arts. And that's because while they live at Edgewater, they really call back to Mr. Ginrette's house on the island of St. Croix, Cane Garden, which is no longer part of the Ginrette Foundation's portfolio of properties, but I think really relevant to the kind of larger context of how these objects end up in the collection. So starting on this project, the catalog record for this image was pretty sparse. No name of an artist, no provenance before Donald Held, no date outside of the rather large range of 1840 to 1880. So I really started this armed with very little information. I didn't really expect to find much out about this watercolor. And the project that I really envisioned ending up with here was one much more focused on using this scene to tell a generic story about an upper class, what an upper class home on the island might look like. And thinking, of course, also about the fascinating portrait of a presumably enslaved woman who sits at the front door, the front entrance to the room here. But looking closer at this object, I was actually able to move this project into a totally different and very unexpected and exciting direction. So to walk through a quick visual analysis, just because this image is so interesting, we're seeing here the main hall or reception room of a larger house, of course. At the image's center, the front doorway opens to a porch, also open. overlooking a green mountainous landscape. Sitting on the porch in that doorway is a likely enslaved woman who's wearing a blue gown, a red and white head wrap. She wears an apron and seems to be sewing or mending some kind of textile. Rather than the polished mahogany floors described and depicted in other 18th and 19th century Caribbean interiors, the floor in this room appears to be covered with a canvas floor cloth. The walls are decorated with blue and gold wallpaper. Wall hangings include 5 paintings or drawings. 2 of them are definitely landscapes, 2 portraits, one maybe a still life. It's very hard to see. It's the one above the table with the green tablecloth. And 2 large mirrors next to the closed jalousie windows. The room is heavily furnished and decorated. In the foreground, you can see a large circular wooden table with turned legs that appear to be on casters and covered in a red floral patterned textile. This table is like especially striking to me. It's so large, it takes up so much of the image in a really interesting way. The table is flanked by an upholstered couch and what appears to be a desk or work table on the left and a sideboard on the right. In the middle ground, we see various furnishings, including a dresser, 2 small wooden tables, 2 wooden chairs with their seat rails exposed, 2 pier tables, a kettle with a stand, and a large rectangular wooden table with a green textile covering it. Lots of smaller objects throughout this image, some recognizable, some not. This is very blown up. This is much smaller and harder to see in person. A number of glasses, for example, are on the sideboard, which are very hard to see until you have a magnifying glass. Well, I sped through a pretty basic look just across this interior. What I actually want to focus on for the rest of my time is what's on the back. When Grant and I unframed this watercolor, we found a few lines of text written in pencil on the back, which was actually not mentioned in the catalog record. So this was a huge surprise to us. We also did unframe this in Mr. Jenrett's bathroom, as you can see here in the middle. So this is a surprise to us, though we did later find that there was a photocopy. You can see in the leftmost image that some of this text is actually covered up with the mat. And we did find a photocopy of the text kind of hidden, folded up and hidden within the frame. This is obviously very exciting. The only problem, of course, is that I do not read Danish, or what I assumed was Danish. I don't read Danish to the point that I actually couldn't even really identify if the language I was looking at was Danish. So I spent the better part of a week attempting to translate and transcribe the text on the back of this image. And outside of a few words, Google Translate was mostly unhelpful. And I really reached a point of desperation so severe that I started like getting on social media and asking if anybody reads Danish and texting people to see if they know anyone who reads Danish. The world opened up for me here, so to speak, when I made out the back half of the top sentence here, which reads, "C. Kunson's home in the West Indies." So as good historians do, I started Googling all kinds of weird combinations of the words Kunsen, West Indies, Kunsen, Christiansted, Kunsen, St. Croix, C. Kunsen, Frederiksted, etc. My efforts were rewarded when I stumbled upon a Carl Frederick Kunsen, born 1800 in Copenhagen and a chief judge in Christiansted, St. Croix. I found this C. Kunsen actually in the publicly available dissertation of a historian in Copenhagen and was able to email him to confirm that our C. Kunsens were in fact the same guy. And that historian thankfully was able to translate the remainder of the inscription on the back of the watercolor, which reads in full, "From mother's uncle C. Kunsen's home in the West Indies, Horn," which is someone's surname, and Horsens, the city, "sent this together with a painting of great-grandmother Dahlen after mother's death." With this knowledge, I was absolutely delighted to locate Carl Kunsen in 1841, 1855, and 1860 Danish West Indies censuses. On the left is the 1841 census, and on the right, 1855, just so you can get a sense of what these documents look like. Not only narrowing the location of this definitively to Christiansted, where Kunsen lived, but perhaps his specific address, which was so much more than I ever thought I would find about this interior. Kunzen arrived in St. Croix in 1840 at 40 years old. Despite being married, his wife actually stays in Copenhagen. She is not recorded in any of the censuses, though she continues to appear in censuses there. And his household in 1841 on Queen Street here included just one other person, a presumably enslaved. This is not actually specified in the census records. People are all listed as either part of the household or as servants, presumably enslaved people, but it's kind of hard to tell for sure. Just one other person, presumably enslaved cook named Charlotte Williams, who's 50, born in Christiansted. My initial response to finding this was, oh my God, I found her. I identified this woman. Of course, nothing is ever that easy because by 1855, Kunzen actually moves from Queen Street to Strand Street, closer to the water. And his household between those moves grew much larger, including servants, again, who I assume are enslaved, Mary Kernand from Puerto Rico, a married couple, Felix and Maria Doherty, and their 4 children, Emily, Nedford, Ferdinand, and Frederica. Again, by 1860, Kunzen's home at Strand Street grows even more. Mary Kernand and Maria Doherty, who are, I think, the 2 most likely possibilities for the identity of the woman in the interior scene, are still in Kunzen's household. Maria's daughter, Emily, now has a child of her own. Her other children, Nedford, Ferdinand, Frederica, and now 3-year-old Alice, all still live in Kunzen's household. And 6 more people, 12-year-old Augusta Custonian and George and Nanny Henry, a married couple, and their children, Robert, Charles, and Hosanna, are now living in Kunzen's household. Kunzen was likely paid handsomely as a colonial official, evidenced both by his well-furnished and decorated home, but also by his growing household staff between his arrival on the island in 1841 and his last appearance in a St. Croix census in 1860. And while I wish I could tie a neater bow on this right now and tell you which house is depicted, the Queen Street or the Strand Street house, the identity of the woman sitting in the scene, Mary Kernand or Maria Doherty, I hope you will, like me, be satiated for now with the knowledge that I am getting closer. There are, of course, so many avenues to continue work on this piece, searching for an artist, of course, and diving deeper into the objects depicted in Kunzen's home. And while I haven't yet found an artist, I do want to end on the only remotely comparable colonial St. Croix interior I've located as of now, painted by the best known Danish colonial painter, Henrik Gottfried Bienfeldt, who primarily painted scenes of urban life in Copenhagen and Christiansted. And I apologize for this image quality. This is not a black and white image. This is a watercolor that is colored, but there's no great image in color. Though painted in the late 18th century, Bienfeldt's dinner party, pictured here in the collection of the National Museum of Denmark, depicts another well-furnished, elite St. Croix interior. 8 white figures, identified by Bienfeldt as colonial officials, and one wife of a colonial official at the head of the table, are dine while being served by an enslaved man who is shown fanning the table on the right, and a mixed race woman who stands at the image's far left holding a dish. Rare in their own right and separated by at least 4 decades, these 2 Christiansted interior scenes really remind us of the human cost of the buildings, objects, and art we're very lucky to steward and study today. I take the opportunity to hopefully reunite this woman's likeness with her name very seriously, and hope that the next time I'm talking about this, I will be able to do that. But thank you so much to everybody at the Genrat Foundation. This has been a truly wonderful experience. Thanks.
Thank you, Bethany. Great detective work on that work of art. So our final speaker for the evening is Sarah Egan. Sarah is a second-year graduate student at the Bard Graduate Center in New York City. So Sarah's project focused on a fascinating portrait of a young John Phillips Montgomery and his hobby horse. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Sarah. Welcome to the virtual podium.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Thank you, Grant, and thank you to everyone at the Jenrette Foundation and to my fellow fellows for such an amazing experience a couple weeks ago, and I'm excited to share my presentation about Jacob Eichholz's portrait of John Phillips Montgomery at Edgewater. A large portrait of a young boy wearing a red jumpsuit hangs in the Octagon Library at Edgewater. Angled towards a window facing the Hudson River, the boy's glance lands on the doorway connecting the library to the rest of the house. He holds reins attached to a hobby horse and rests one foot on the horse's green stand. The sitter is portrayed at just about life size and might be imagined stepping out of the gilded frame and into the brightly green carpeted room. Richard Jenrette was particularly fond of this painting, selecting it for the back cover of his book, More Adventures with Old Houses. He called it, quote, perhaps the most dramatic and attention-getting painting at Edgewater, end quote, and believed the river and sloping hills in the background represented the Hudson Valley. Hung in a room with other political portraits, landscape paintings, and busts, 7 of them, including of Abraham Lincoln and Chief Justice John Jay, the portrait adds a sense of playfulness and a familial dimension to an otherwise politically oriented room. By looking at biographical information related to the sitter and the painter, as well as the objects painted within the portrait, I aim to understand this painting as both an object in Richard Jenrette's collection and as a trace of early 19th century wealthy American family life. While focusing on an earlier time period than this painting, Margaret Lovell writes about 18th century family portraits similar to this one as intentional markers of a changing early American society, one which was self-consciously upwardly mobile. As a result, they can be, quote, usefully read as documents of socially appropriate behavior and relationships, if not of specific realities, end quote. What sort of adult was this child meant to grow up to be? Jacob Eichholz painted this portrait of John Phillips Montgomery around 1823, when the sitter would have been around 5 years old. John was the oldest child of Philadelphia natives John Craythorne Montgomery and Elizabeth Henriette Phillips Montgomery, and was born on September 28, 1818. Thomas Sully painted Elizabeth and John Craythorne in the 1810s, and these portraits of the young couple still hang together in Rhinebeck at the Wilderstein Historic Site in the sitting room. Elizabeth and John married in 1817, and sometime during the 1820s took partial residence of Eglinton, their no longer extant house south of Tivoli. An 1875 biography of John Phillips's brother, Reverend Henry Eglinton Montgomery, mentions their protracted residence on the Hudson, where he was privately educated by tutors, probably with his older brother John, before entering the University of Pennsylvania. John Phillips was baptized in 1818, and he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania as well in 1837. He worked as a lawyer in Philadelphia after being admitted to the city's bar in 1840, and he married Anna Boker Clater in 1851. The couple had 5 children, 3 of whom died in childhood and 2 who lived into adulthood, Octavia Clater and James Clater. So many names. John's 1874 passport application describes him as 5'10", with gray hair, blue eyes, a Grecian nose, and a full face. In contrast to the portrait of him as a child, a small view into his adulthood can be read in this application, as well as the uniquely Victorian fixation on physiognomy and physical appearances. John died in 1875 at the age of 57, only a year after applying for his passport. He is buried in St. Peter's Episcopalian Churchyard, and in the end, tracing his life proved fairly difficult, especially in contrast to his more prolific brother, Reverend Henry Eglinton, the grandfather of Daisy Lynch Sukely, from whom Richard Jenrette acquired this painting in 1978. Daisy was the 5th child of Elizabeth Phillips Montgomery and Robert Bound Sukely, and was born in Rhinebeck. Her mother was the daughter of Reverend Henry Eglinton Montgomery. This is confirmed in the letters she wrote to Richard Jenrette when he bought the painting from her. She wrote, "My mother, Elizabeth Phillips Montgomery Sukely, and Miss Elizabeth Montgomery Lynch were granddaughters of John C. Montgomery. Miss Lynch left the portrait to me, the great-granddaughter of John C. Montgomery." This means that John Phillips was Daisy's great-uncle, and so her connection to the painting by Eichholz might have felt distant. Today, Jacob Eichholz is a well-known Pennsylvania painter, and some of his works are in the collections of the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Gallery of Art. He was born in Lancaster in 1776 to German tavern keepers Leonard and Catherine. First trained as a coppersmith, Eichholz turned to portrait painting in 1808 and trained a bit with Thomas Sully, who first believed Jacob's paintings were, quote, hideous. Eichholz began by painting profile portraits and signs, and in 1810 he painted a self-portrait with brushes in hand, seen here, firmly and resolutely establishing his identity as a painter. Historian Thomas R. Ryan writes about this self-portrait in the words of Jacob Eichholz, noting that, quote, portraits are expressions of self-identity. They are text of self. This presents a dynamic way to understand Eichholz's impression and projection of himself in this portrait. In Rebecca Beale's book about her great-grandfather, Eichholz, she summarizes his career with helpful brevity. Quote, the span of Eichholz's activity as a painter is from about 1805 to 1842. This was the American neoclassical period. Like his contemporaries of that period, he strove for the public image, the persona of his subjects. His people appear calm, robust, assured. They are quietly possessed and observed. The contours are firm and hard. Color tends to form definite, self-enclosed areas. End quote. Eichholz's paintings of children, in particular, speak to the prominent social world and landscape he operated in while living in Philadelphia, and demonstrate how wealthy families mediated their status by commissioning portraits of their children. In Beale's words, it is interesting, and I think complicated, to consider the public image and persona of a young child. John Phillips and Eichholz's other subjects, such as Master Schoem, as the painting is called at the Art Institute of Chicago, seen in this slide, they really do look calm, robust, and assured. As a sort of fiction, these portraits reveal more about adult expectations and conceptions of childhood than lived experience. My next section proposes an alternative way to think about childhood in this painting by looking at the objects it depicts. By the 19th century, ideas around American childhood became more self-conscious and defined as the relatively new nation developed. Historian James Martin writes in his introduction to Children and Youth in a New Nation that, quote, the development of the Republic and emergence of new conceptualizations of childhood and youth were inextricably connected. From a historiographic perspective, studying childhood poses a particular challenge to historians, where choices must be made, quote, between writing about children as representations of adult notions about childhood and writing about them as historical actors in their own right. Art history and material culture scholars approach the history of childhood from a slightly different perspective, particularly if we look at objects such as samplers and toys as primary sources. This painting of John Phillips in itself allows us to read the hopes and ambitions of upper-middle-class families as they commission stately portraits of their children. John looks almost regal, gazing away from the painter confidently, thoughtfully. He solidly holds the reins of his hobby horse, perhaps one of the most real objects in the painting. Moving inside the frame of this portrait, I will now briefly discuss the history of hobby horses. The mat has a Chinese ceramic pillow glazed with one of the earliest known depictions of a hobby horse from the 12th or 13th century. The figure also holds a whip and looks off to the side while riding a decorated stick hobby horse. The Met's label notes that hobby horses may have originated in China and then spread to the rest of the world, and have sometimes been cited as the precursor of the bicycle. In Patricia Mullen's The Rocking Horse, A History of Moving Toy Horses, an international survey of the toys, she notes that they grew in popularity during the 18th century, and in Europe, most were made in Germany and England. The V&A also has a very early and rough example of a wooden rocking horse from 1610. Mullins writes about how German immigrants to Pennsylvania during the 19th century made livings for themselves through woodwork and subsequently toy making. Hobby horses emerged in America likely during the second half of the 18th century, and Mullins traces their presence in paintings of children at play and as advertised in trade cards, like one by Gideon Cox in Philadelphia from 1825. While I cannot confidently identify the maker of John Phillips' hobby horse, there is clearly a robust market for the toys in Philadelphia, where the Montgomery primarily lived in the 1810s and 20s. Additionally, an English hobby horse in Mullins's book, I think, looks remarkably like the one in Eichholz's painting. It has a dark green stand and similarly striking eyes. Another notable aspect of the portrait of John is the depiction of his red frilly jumpsuit. Typically called a skeleton suit, this garment was popular for young boys during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These small suits buttoned together at the waistband, which allowed for freer movement. The frilly collar, like the one on John's red suit, was more comfortable than the tighter collars that older men would wear. Textile historian Linda Baumgarten writes about the change in children's dress, reflecting ideas around American families having a, quote, less formal lifestyle, overtly affectionate family relationships, and a new view of childhood as a separate stage in life. In turn, children wore clothes that were more comfortable and suitable for active young people, like a skeleton suit. The 3 buttons on John's pants attached to his top, and a similar example can be found in the collection of the Mint Museum. Richard Jenrette had also commented on the similarities between the portrait of John and an 18th century one by Goya, seen particularly by this young boy's red outfit. By looking closely at the material culture depicted within this painting, more generic and specific understanding of childhood in the 1820s emerges. This interpretation is necessarily generic because the actual objects depicted in this portrait likely no longer exist. Yet the specific sensory experience of them can be imagined. While this understanding is admittedly biased towards wealthier American families, thinking about how John's skeleton suit may have felt to run around and play in, or who might have made his hobby horse, and the long history of such toys, hopefully opens up the painting to a different, more nuanced interpretation. In turn, this allows us to think about how changes in American history affected children. The Montgomery family had a long lineage in the Northeast, and portraits like John's show how they adapted to the times, choosing to dress their oldest child in a brightly colored skeleton suit for a large commissioned painting by a prominent local artist. Paintings like this one, and those of John's parents, were then passed down through generations, eventually ending up in Daisy Suckley's Wilderstein house as heirlooms and traces of the past. Returning now to the Octagon Library at Edgewater and Richard Jenrette's purchase of the painting in the 70s, I would like to briefly consider his love for this painting as camp. He wrote in More Adventures with Old Houses that, quote, its large size fits perfectly in the Octagon Library at Edgewater, and Little Master Montgomery's vivid red jumpsuit catches the eye, end quote. Camp, to Susan Sontag, is a sensibility, or a way of looking at the world and interpreting taste. She notes that camp, quote, is the love of the exaggerated, the off, of things being what they are not. Nothing is more exaggerated in this painting than the hobby horse's piercing eye. It is a painted representation of a fake horse, but it's rendered both realistically and stiffly. Jenrette's referral to John Phillips as Master Montgomery feels tongue-in-cheek. In camp, particularly when one considers the political and public nature of the rest of the portraits and busts displayed in the library. I ultimately found that the archive and written records do not elucidate much of John's life, and in some ways he is best remembered as a young child wearing a skeleton suit. The painting is better understood as a surface, read more as a fiction than an accurate depiction of the child, and as a visually appealing and arresting addition to Edgewater's library. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to all of our presenters this evening. For anyone who wants to rewatch this program or view last year's Thompson Fellowship presentations, please visit the Jenrette Foundation's YouTube page and you can find those. And for anyone in the audience who's an emerging museum professional or current graduate student in a related field and wants to pursue a career focused on historic house museums, please keep the Thompson Fellowship in mind. Application materials for the spring and fall sessions can be found on the Jenrette Foundation's website. And with that, I will thank you all, the audience, for joining us this evening. We'll wish you a good evening and thank you again for attending. So have a